Well, good morning and welcome. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. And it really has been quite a difficult and extraordinary week, especially the beginning part. In Houston, as the worst floodwaters in American history finally now begin to recede, so many questions remain. We are left to wonder about human nature, about future predictions associated with climate change, about how to rebuild a huge metropolitan area, rebuild lives, rebuild community. Perhaps the mightiest of all hurricanes unveiled a universal truth, recognized by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said some 150 years ago, "We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken. The whole human family is bathed with an element of love like a fine ether." So Emerson's reflection makes me think of the human kindness that surfaced during Hurricane Harvey. There have been some great stories bathed in love, and one that may be remembered for a long time centers on the El Bolillo Bakery. 7 Mexican bakers who couldn't make it home in the floods, and so they stayed in the bakery and they baked around the clock and around the clock again, producing hundreds of beautiful pan dulces which were distributed to shelters and churches to feed the hungry. They don't sound like bad hombres to me. We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken. Indeed. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. And may we open our service turning our hymn books to one of 2 new hymns that we're going to sing this morning. If we don't come through, we're going back to the same old hymn. So turn to hymn books to number 127.
Before Labor Day came to signify barbecues, sales, and sleeping in, there was a time when it represented a threat to worker injustice. And it's high time we brought it back. We can start by affirming our own goodness as workers, by recognizing that we are not just our work, but work only makes a portion of the sum of our lives. And by placing ourselves in solidarity with those who cannot choose their work or the circumstances of their work. I now invite you into a spirit of prayer, meditation, or reflection. May each of us find work that sustains us physically and spiritually, that provides security for our families and contributes to the good of the whole. May we be physically and emotionally safe while we do our work. May our work never be put into the service of oppressing another human being. May all kinds of work, both intellectual and manual, both paid and volunteer, be honored. May those who come to this country from other lands to work be safe and free from harm. May children around the world be free to grow up in their own time and be allowed to go to school before beginning their life's work. May women find equity and freedom in their work, and may no human body ever be a currency or a product. May those with bodily limitations and those who rest from their labors be afforded the greatest of respect by the societies they have served. Let us in silence add our own prayers and affirmations. May we all commit ourselves to justice and equity for all workers, not just on Labor Day, but every day. And may we find within ourselves the courage to make it so. Amen. On March 25th, 1911, Mrs. Gordon Norrie was just sitting down to tea with a group of friends when they heard a commotion outside. One of her guests, Frances Perkins, then 31, was from an old but middle-class family which could trace its lineage back to the time of the Revolution. A butler rushed in and announced that there was a fire on the square. The ladies ran out. Perkins lifted up her skirts and sprinted toward it. It was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, one of the most famous fires in American history. Perkins joined the throng of horrified onlookers on the sidewalk below. Some saw what they thought were bundles of fabric falling from the windows. They thought the factory owners were saving their best material. As the bundles continued to fall, the onlookers realized they were not bundles at all. They were people hurling themselves to their death. People had just begun to jump as we got there, Perkins would later remember. They had been holding on all that time, being crowded by others behind them, the fire pressing closer and closer. The fire and its aftershocks left a deep mark on Frances Perkins. Up until that point, she had labored for worker rights and on behalf of the poor, but she had been on a conventional trajectory, toward a conventional marriage, perhaps, and a life of genteel good works. After the fire, moral indignation set her on a different course. Her own desires and her own self became less central, and the cause itself became more central to the structure of her life. The niceties of her class fell away. She became impatient with the way genteel progressives went about serving the poor. She became impatient with their prissiness, their desire to stay pure and above the fray. Perkins was willing to take morally hazardous action if it would prevent another catastrophe like the one that befell the women at the Triangle Factory. She was willing to compromise and work with corrupt officials if it would produce results. She pinioned herself to this cause for the rest of her life. In our age of individual autonomy, life is determined by a series of individual choices, a life that begins with the self and ends with the self, that begins with self-investigation and ends in self-fulfillment. But Frances Perkins, who would become the first Secretary of Labor and the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, found her purpose in life using a different method, one that was more common in past eras. In this method, you don't ask, what do I want from life? You ask a different set of questions. What does life want from me? What are my circumstances calling me to do? As the novelist Frederick Buechner put it, at what point do my talents and deep gladness meet the world's deep need? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire wasn't the only event that defined Frances Perkins' purpose in life, but it was a major one. And like many people, she found a fiercer resolve amid a flood of righteous rage. It wasn't just that so many people had died. After all, they could not be brought back to life. It was also the ongoing assault on the common order that the fire came to symbolize. The person who experiences this kind of indignation has found her vocation.
All right, the first of the announcements is that next Sunday we return to normal church. There will be 2 services next Sunday, 9 and 11, filled with children and young families, and it's going to feel the way it usually does feel around here. So if you come next week at 10 o'clock, you're going to have nothing but coffee. I can see some people taking a note. Okay, it's going to be sure to be there at 10 o'clock, so we get some coffee. But no, we resume 2 services, 9 and 11 next Sunday, and that'll take us through to the following June. A couple of other real brief announcements. Again, you know, when I look over the announcements, when I come in here in the mornings, I am literally stunned by just the breadth of announcements that cover everything from social to social justice, fun stuff to things we really ought to do because they're important. Please take a look at the announcements really carefully. Let me just call out just a couple, maybe because there's some maybe time related or time urgent. One is next Sunday. I want to make clear that there was a little confusion. Next Sunday, following the 11 o'clock service, we will be having our first of the year's Social Justice Council meeting in room 201. And this is going to be a real important kickoff. We have two main concerns that we are talking about, and concerns in a good way. The first is we're going to go over all the legal ramifications of our church being a sanctuary, and we're getting closer and closer to that need. Already just this past week, there was a family that sought sanctuary, and they were accommodated by another church. But we're working closely with the interfaith community for that. We're also going to be talking, and I'll finally have a chance to explain our new partnership. Our church has now partnered with Planned Parenthood, which has offered amazing possibilities. Yeah, we could do that. And so we will detail that. Obviously, you as the congregation will hear about it too, but we'll get the real particulars of social justice, wonderful opportunities, especially for women, for our teenagers, and actually for everybody who will sign up for that. So, yeah, so that's going to be next Sunday after the 11 o'clock service in room 201. Please be advised, I can't say enough for our small group ministry program, which really allows us to get better acquainted, to have an opportunity to speak to one another without the din of the noise at coffee hour, but to really concentrate and really form relationships with some of the really wonderful people in this congregation. Small group ministry, they meet once a month, a group of about 10 to 12. We need you to register for that. You can do that at the Congregational Life Table. You can also do that online. Also wish to mention that in an effort to communicate better as a congregation so everybody is in the know, we have gone back to our newsletter, The Torch, on a once-a-month basis, having a paper copy, and also in the intervening weeks, having little updates about what's happening. But you need to sign on. And so at the welcoming table right here, please take a look at all the options. If you want to have a paper torch, sign up, and also if you want to get all the supplemental issues, make it known, and you too will be in the know as far as this community is concerned at First Unitarian Church. Take a look at all the other important announcements, and while you're doing that, it's a great time to gratefully receive the offering, to greet one another, wish each other a good day and a welcome to First Unitarian Church. You know, Labor Day has a rather awkward history and remains riddled with contradictions still today. President Grover Cleveland gets the credit for making Labor Day a national holiday in 1894 to honor America's labor movement, and yet, in that very same year, he sent federal troops to Chicago to crush the Pullman strike, and scores of picketers were killed. Currently, less than 10%, imagine that, less than 10% of America's workforce is unionized. The power of unions have eroded terribly over the years, as collective bargaining rights have been decimated by newly imposed state laws. You know, I think we ought to be honest and actually remove Labor Day from the calendar as a holiday. I mean, you know, what's the point other than we would never know when the summer really ended? And who knows, with Scott Pruitt dismantling the EPA, summer may never end. You know, just keep it going. It'll be hot and hotter. American workers are at the bottom of union membership among all developed nations in the world. Scandinavian countries have 70% of their workers unionized. The highest percentage of union workers in our country peaked in 1945, when a whopping 35% of workers belonged to unions. The tensions between owners of industry and the workers who provide the labor for owners to profit while receiving minimal levels of compensation defines America's labor philosophy. In most Western nations, where government helps arbitrate the self-interest between labor and management, our government plays no such role. Our philosophy is for government never to overreach, thereby casting a blind eye to workers being abused or oppressed in the name of the capitalist spirit. We insist that the market determine wages, even working conditions, ignoring any and all moral considerations of how a worker's life may be adversely affected. Accumulating greater and greater profit margins for the wealthy remains unfettered in our country, where everybody is free to amass great wealth without any government interference to level the playing field when it comes to income. And so it's easy, really, to connect the dots that help us understand why American workers receive no family leave time, no child care subsidies, why 48 million Americans had no health care before President Obama's Affordable Care Act, why there are no tuition-free colleges, and why wealth inequality is greater in our country than anywhere else in the entire world. And yet we show neither remorse nor shame. In fact, quite the opposite. Our current administration is on a tear to erode and weaken the enforcement of labor standards and even legal safeguards, placing workers at risk by exposing them to unsafe workplaces and toxic carcinogenic chemicals doesn't even begin to pose a problem of conscience, let alone shredding all ethical considerations of how human beings need to treat one another. So when we consider our nation's labor history and the abysmal state of affairs at present, a simple word comes to mind: justice. Justice. What does that word even mean anymore? And when you think about justice beyond just the wish, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we all lived in a just world? Get beyond that. We've got to recognize that justice is a loaded term. It's conceivably quite dangerous. Now, superficially, the term justice is really innocent. Hey, we all want justice. We want to believe that justice is part of our nation, like God and motherhood, apple pie, football, and Twitter. But justice can also ignite a revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. These concepts were codified in 1789 in France to mean being able to do anything that does no harm to others. That kind of smacks of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But you know, that's a hard mandate to keep when the whiff of increased profits and wealth and luxury leads to greed and self-interest, even at a severe cost to others. The French continued, the exercise of natural rights of every man and woman, they say, has no bounds other than those that guarantee other members of society the enjoyment of those same rights. Yeah, so you could do whatever you want as long as everybody, men and women, they included women, enjoys those same rights. Also included was the idea the law must be the same for all, whether to protect or punish. Funny, you know, at that time there was no reference to emoluments, even though that's another fine French word, émoluer, wasn't there. Americans, especially those of deep fundamental religious beliefs, see justice more as God intervening in history as a corrective of the errant ways of humanity. It is only just that God punish those whose departure from conventional behavior threatens the moral fibers of community. And thus we have the likes of the Reverend Tony Perkins, fundamentalist preacher who also, a huge church, who also served as president of the Family Research Council. Wow. And there he is spreading the word that natural disasters are sent by God as judgments for homosexuality. Now, when the floodwaters hit his hometown in Baton Rouge exactly a year ago, and he and his family were forced to evacuate in their canoe, he said he'd have to study more carefully just what God's message really was. He better. But God's message delivered unto Houston this past week was very clear to Ann Coulter. She determined it was retribution. Retribution, a form of justice, like an eye for an eye. Retribution for Houston having elected a lesbian mayor. Well, we may be in trouble right here in Salt Lake City. Better get one of those emergency bags ready, just in case. But you know, two can play this game. My theological interpretation of the devastation in Houston is that God was really angry with Governor Greg Abbott, who had just imposed the harshest penalties in the nation on any and every city in Texas that did not cooperate with immigration authorities. Whatever happened to the idea of God as love and compassion? God as merciful to all, including 600,000 undocumented immigrants in Houston alone. Do justice. Love mercy. Walk humbly with thy God. Some translations say, seek justice. Love mercy. Walk humbly with thy God. Unitarian Universalists come closest to this injunction from the prophet Micah in our second principle. We seek justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Now, what is paramount in those three ideals, those three virtues coming together as one thread, justice, compassion, equity, one thread, is that they really are inseparable. If you have compassion, then the next step is automatic. That's a no-brainer. With compassion, one seeks justice. As a reflex action to compassion, we seek a way in which people are fair and impartial with one another. Equity in human relations. So I go back to all members of society must enjoy the same rights and freedoms. That basic, simple, humane, and ethical concept can start a revolution. There is nothing more basic than equity. If you have any doubt that we are hardwired for this, watch a bunch of 2-year-olds at play. They know how hard it is to share, and yet they're always on the alert should another 2-year-old gain an advantage. Franz de Waal, one of the great primatologists, did an experiment with capuchin monkeys about unequal pay. It was a TED Talk a few years ago and has received over 13 million hits. So some of you may have seen it. There were two capuchin monkeys in a cage, separate cages, side by side. And they were trained successfully that when the human experimenter put his hand in the cage, and there was an easy slot, easily acceptable, and the monkey gave the experimenter a pebble, why then the human would reciprocate and give the monkey a cucumber. That was really great. Lovely cucumber slice. Everybody was happy. It was great. Until the experiment showed that in the cage next to this capuchin monkey was another monkey. Did the same thing. Guy put out his hand, received a pebble, only this time that neighboring monkey received a grape. Now, you may be unaware of the hierarchy of delicacies among capuchin monkeys, but receiving a grape is like caviar. It's the best. And so the very first monkey, there he goes back, gives the stone back to the experimenter, gets a cucumber. He takes the cucumber and he throws it at the experimenter. I would have done the same thing, wouldn't you? They repeated this a couple of times. The neighbor kept getting the grape, got the cucumber, just threw it right back, just threw it in the face of the experimenter. It was honest rage about the unfairness of it all. The rage, I mean, as I said, this was on YouTube. Watching the rage was actually painful. The distress of the obvious inequity was palpable. All primates, humans, monkeys, care deeply about fairness. It matters not only what you receive, but also what the other guy gets. Researchers, turning their attention to people, examined airplane rage by collecting data from millions of flights. And the biggest factor was whether or not the plane had a first-class cabin. If passengers walked onto a plane and were exposed to the relaxed luxury of people in first class, sipping their champagne, waiting for takeoff, well, these people work their way through to their own seats in economy, incidents of rage were likely to happen 4 times as frequently as when they entered the plane at midpoint, not having to go through first class, or if there was no first-class cabin to begin with. And so the conclusion reached by researchers was, and I quote, "Inequality destabilizes society." Wow. Now think about it. Inequality destabilizes society. And so that's why I say justice is a loaded term. It's a term, it's a principle that can ignite a revolution. Fairness, equity in human relations sits at the very center of our being. For emphasis. Inequality destabilizes society. Now, we saw that after Hurricane Katrina. How many of us really understood the rage when African Americans stood on rooftops because their poverty forced them to live in these low-lying areas? And we might see inequality again following Hurricane Harvey. 600,000 undocumented people lost their hiding places and stand now fully exposed in shelters, hoping to stay dry, receive some food, and not be victimized again. We shall see. So African Americans who taste the ashes of inequality throughout their lives will say convincingly, white people don't understand the rage. White lives are not necessarily easy. They're not always treated fairly. But they don't understand the depth of unfairness that leaves spiritual scars, physical scars, generation after generation after generation. The experience of fairness is so far from most African American lives that they need to remind this destabilized society, hey, wait a minute, Black lives matter. Black lives matter. The law must be the same for everyone. Now that's justice. If it fails to reach out everywhere, there is rage. And more rage. And more. We as a nation have lost sight of what is referred to as the common good. Or at least we stand sufficiently divided. You know, on one side is the idea of expressing compassion for everyone, a greater sense of fairness and sharing that closes the gap of income inequality. Life that becomes more equitable. But on the other side is freedom and autonomy for the individual with no connection or responsibility to the common good. That's really the big divide in our nation right now, is how we see the common good. But here's what happens when compassion goes missing from the equation altogether. Hurricane Sandy, 2012, unleashed total devastation along the eastern seaboard, mainly along New Jersey and New York. But in January 2013, 23 U.S. congressmen from Texas and both U.S. senators, including Ted Cruz, voted against a relief package for Sandy victims. These governmental representatives insisted on fiscal responsibility, with Ted Cruz going so far as to say, and I quote, "Emergency relief shelters shouldn't be used as Christmas trees." Well, now it's all about Texas. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How does that work? Might the great state of Texas call for an exception to the golden rule? You know, I'm sure that with the glut of evangelicals there, they're working on a loophole. Somewhere, somehow, the golden rule doesn't really need to be reciprocal. Essentially, we're witnessing the non-practice of compassion on a large scale. Now, I'm certain that most of us have experienced compassion on an individual basis. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a good example where one guy alone demonstrates enormous compassion. But what happens when compassion is raised a notch or two or three, and compassion is raised to a more corporate or wider institutional level in which all people are free to flourish? The common good transcends self-interest. That is what is called justice. Justice is a systematic way for ensuring that fairness be distributed among all people. Seeking justice is the extension of compassion writ large. When compassion rises to institutional levels, justice results. Justice and compassion, you see, justice and compassion are inseparable. Together, they allow equity in human relations. What is the role of the church in all of this? What are we supposed to be doing? If a church wants to be part of the process that seeks justice, does justice, wants to establish justice, three very obvious responsibilities and commitments come to my mind. I'd like to share them. They're brief. 1, defend human rights. Own the moral authority that speaks about not harming others. All members of society must enjoy the same rights. The law must be extended to everybody in the same way. We must serve as the moral voice that defends human rights. Secondly, aid the poor. Until society becomes just, the church must ensure that the poor, the marginalized, the powerless can find a shred of dignity. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care are human rights. We must be generous in our offerings, and we must do all that we can to prevent legislators from tearing up any vestige of the safety net while at the same time voting tax cuts for billionaires. Third, hospitality for the oppressed. This old biblical injunction calls for now a new ethical paradigm, a paradigm for today's world. Sebastian Salgado documented the endless migration of human populations seeking hospitality. The church must address the consequences of global economy, famine caused by climate change, and health epidemics that threaten the poor. If a church wishes to seek justice, it must ask one very simple question. Are all the people in society, are all the people being served? All the people, regardless of race, class, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion. Manifesting compassion beyond one's own tribe constitutes the leadership demanded of our churches and this church at this time in history. $1,000,000 question. Is this political? What do you think? You bet it is. Isn't politics the art and science of securing the common good for the community? Isn't that what politics is? Securing the common good for all in society, for all in our community. So as a church seeking justice, we have no choice but to be drawn into what is called political. But don't let that scare you. Let us be clear about our task in this very complex and difficult world. In this community, we must make our actions and our voices be heard as we seek compassion, justice, equity in human relations. That's the business of the church for today. That's the business of the church moving forward. So be it. Can we close our service, turning our hymn books, please, to number 307. As we extinguish the chalice, I want to recall, and remain standing, I want to recall the words of one of my mentors from the Unitarian Universalists, we call them First Parishes in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Ralph Helverson. He said, we have religion. We have religion when we look upon people with all their failings and still find in them good. We have religion when we have done all that we can, and then in confidence entrust ourselves to the life that is larger than ourselves. Amen. David, thank you, thank you. You know, that was a literal musical interpretation of seeking justice. Could you just start the beginning again? Just start the beginning. Go ahead. Seeking justice. Go. Thank you, thank you.